Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday to you all. It is so good to see you, your bright and shining faces. Bryce, Faith, Luke, Glenn, Bree, Beth Ann, B, Tom. It is so good to see you all. David, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us for Daily Devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And today is going to be a little bit different, principally because if you've been following along with the reading plan, you know that the former reading plan that we just finished up with Revelation 22 just yesterday on Thursday, and that means that we're beginning something new, our 2022 Redeeming Life reading plan. And so if you want access to this, we can give you a digital copy. We also have print copies. If you want a digital copy to have on hand or on your computer, you can request one at danschuler86@gmail.com, and I'll send you a copy personally, and we'll get you the reading plan so that you can follow along daily and know what we're teaching on Wednesdays and Sundays, and just follow along with us on this adventure, this journey through the New Testament in 1 year. That's our goal, and we're going to stick to it. But when you get a copy of this reading plan, one of the things that you might notice is that from January 1st to June 2nd, we are going to be working our way through the first 4 books of the Bible that are typically called the Gospels. Gospels. The Gospels. And what we thought together, Jesse and I, was that because from January 1st to June 6th, that's almost a whole half a year that we're going to be spending through just 4 books and trying to break it down to manageable chunks so that we can get a big picture about what the Gospels are all about, that we would take this one day on New Year's Eve to give you a picture, almost like a bird's eye view about what the Gospels are like, and then offer something of a brief introduction into the first Gospel that we're going to be jumping right into January 1st, Saturday of 2022. That's right. I can't remember these calendar dates. And get an introduction to the first of the Gospels that we're going to be jumping into. So, let's ask the question, what is a gospel? Contrary to popular belief, Gospels don't just refer to a typical genre of music, but even though it's in some way related to that, but I digress. Gospels, in short, is an English translation of the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. That's what the Gospels are all about. Good news. Oh, how about I put in an S there? Good news. That's more like it. And so, good news. It's like an announcement of something grand, something wonderful, something beautiful that's taken place, and by virtue of what it is that's happened, our lives are changed. We're affected. The world that we live in is in a new place because there's been a whole new world of possibilities because of this good news of something that's happened. And so the Gospels are, in essence, good news. So we might ask ourselves, if we're talking about these Gospels, what is the good news that these 4 Gospels are all about? And in short, something you could say that this good news is about the God of the universe who has come to rescue his people, to restore his creation, and inaugurate, to establish his heavenly reign on earth. This is principally about what God has done. And what he has done chiefly, instrumentally, through his Son, Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, and that the Gospels are all about the good news of what God has done through Jesus Christ. And that's one of the reasons why you could also refer to Gospels as the nearest analogy that we have to a type of a book or literature that it's about. You could call them almost like biographies. It's telling that as biographies, they're focused on the words and the works of Jesus Christ during his life and ministry here on earth. And so that's what we're looking at right here. So when you're sitting down to read a gospel, what it consists of, the substance of it, is this: eyewitness testimony to the words and the works of Jesus Christ, about what God has done to inaugurate his reign here on earth through Jesus Christ. That's in essence what it is that you're getting out of these. And it's important also to remember that when it comes to regarding the Gospels as eyewitness testimony, that this is not simply just about information or nice ideas, hollow theology, but this is that what we have in the Gospels is inextricably tied to events and things that actually happen in human history. This is the self-understanding about what a gospel actually is, and why it is that the authors of the gospel sit down to write and record the things that they do. And why that's also important, or perhaps you might even say the main importance about this, is that if the Gospels are good news about what God has done, what this essentially means is that the beginning of the good news, the only reason why it is that we have good news, is not because of something that we have done or something that we have discovered, but is a living eyewitness testimony to what God has done. In other words, by God's sheer act of grace towards his people to take action, to take the first step in rescuing, redeeming his people and making them new, that all of this bespeaks to what God has done by taking the first step as being the person who has come to rescue us. So, in other words, by understanding these things as Gospels, we understand, it's like we're looking at Jesus' life and his works through the lens of grace. Because this is not because of anything that we have done, but principally what God has done. And we might ask the question further, a question that has been posed to me by a person who taught me church history, because church history begins here with the Gospels, thank goodness, is this question: are we reaching up to God, or is God reaching down to us? Are we reaching up to God, or is God reaching down to us? And if we understand this as good news, Gospels, about what God has done, it's clear that the reason why we have a story to tell is because of what God has done. Because he was the one who reached down to us. And that gives me hope. And it gives me not just a mind for what it is that I'm looking forward to and I'm sitting down to read a gospel, but my heart is sort of softened, it's conditioned to open my eyes to see the things that God has done. To rescue his people when we were hopeless and helpless. And so that's what a gospel is. Now, the question, I guess the next question, the logical question that we would ask is, why do we have 4 different Gospels? Which, if you read them before, you'll know that these Gospels are Matthew, oftentimes abbreviated as MT, or Mark, abbreviated as MK, or Luke, abbreviated as LK, or John, abbreviated as JN. Why do we have 4 different Gospels? And not only why is it that we have 4 different Gospels, but why is it that at least 3 of them, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke, bear striking similarities, uncanny similarities in the stories that they tell? Indeed, there is gracious overlap between these Gospels, where if perchance you had lost, say, the book of Mark, that you would still have preserved in Matthew and Luke almost the entirety of Mark's gospel, so that you wouldn't actually be losing anything if suddenly Mark disappeared. Similarly with Matthew, if Matthew was taken away, you would have most of the material already preserved in Mark and Luke. And the same way with Luke in relationship to Matthew and Mark. And then John, granted, is kind of in his own league, as it were. I guess if he's in his own league, it means he's playing solitaire, but that's a bad joke. The question goes, why is it that we have these 4 different Gospels? And the reason why it is that we have 4 different Gospels, if I could summarize it as this, is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they have, it's not simply that they want to tell us what Jesus has done. They want to show us what Jesus has done and who he is. To bring to basically later generations, people who were not eyewitnesses, to bring them back into the world in which they lived, and not just tell them the things that Jesus said and tell them the things that he did, but to show them. And if they're taking the trouble to show them, what that means is that they have different emphases in mind. They have different themes. They have certain things that they want to show us about who Jesus is that they want us to grasp. And so what that means is that there's certain emphases that Matthew has that Luke doesn't have, or that Luke has that Mark and Matthew don't have, or that Mark has that Matthew and Luke and John don't have, or things that John wants to emphasize that Luke, Mark, and Matthew don't emphasize as much. And so what that means is that we want to be able to try and not just focus on the little things that the gospel writers are wanting to teach us, but also to catch the things that they're emphasizing, so that we can not just hear about the things that Jesus said and did, but that we can be shown what it is that who Jesus is and what it is that he's done. The effect of what we have in God's wisdom in giving us 4 different Gospels, in the words of Carson and Moo, it's like our portrait of Jesus has stereoscopic depth. That's a fancy way of saying that the Jesus who we see described in the Gospels is not just a 2-dimensional paper doll. He has depth. He has personality. He has mission, indeed, and the significance of who he is and what it is that he's done is something that could never truly be adequately summed up in one biography, in one eyewitness testimony. That each of the gospel writers have something about Jesus to show us, and we want to be good readers, good listeners, and to see what it is that not just the gospel writers are telling us, but to see what it is that they're showing us. So, about the differences between these different gospels and their biographical portraits of Jesus Christ. Now, I want to try something a little new. It's a little bit different, and I want to see if this is something that works or is helpful for us as we're trying to sit down and read the Gospels well. It was, I believe, Irenaeus, a 2nd century church father. What that means is he's a leader within the early church after the period of the leadership of the apostles. That the apostles pass on their authority and their leadership to people who are going to carry on the mission of the church. Irenaeus was one of them in the next century following the passing of Jesus' disciples. And so Irenaeus, when he was reflecting on the nature of the 4 Gospels and why it is that we have 4 Gospels, it was Irenaeus who, in attempting to describe or capture the differences between the biographical portraits of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he offered us a visual aid to help us understand the particular the differences between these 4. So now that we know that these different Gospels have different emphases in mind, things that they want to demonstrate to us, the readers, let's take a zoom in, a closer look at the Gospel that we're going to be focusing on for basically the next 6 weeks. And that is the Gospel of Matthew. And so we're going to try and make this a little bigger and say, what is it that we're going to find in this Gospel of Matthew? And one of the things that you'll come to notice about Matthew is that he is prolific in his Old Testament quotations and also allusions and echoes, where he, more than any other of the gospel writers, really strives to demonstrate to us about the continuity between the work of Jesus here in the present, that he's what God has done, and its connection, its consistency with the acts of God among his people, for his people, to rescue his people in the Old Testament. And which is another thing that leads us to believe that whoever it is that Matthew is writing to, that his audience is very Jewish in mind, in all likelihood. So yeah, lots of Old Testament quotations. What that also means is that for Matthew, and also I remark in passing, just because any one of these gospel writers have an emphasis in mind, that doesn't mean that that Mark or Luke or John have no mention of it whatsoever. There's thematic overlap between Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, because all of them, they have Old Testament quotations. But Matthew is the one who, because he's employing them more often, more consistently, more frequently for us, we have a clear idea that he wants us to see the connections that he's making. So that's one thing. Another big one, is about Christology. That's a fancy word for about the way in which he's trying to demonstrate how Jesus is the Messiah. Let's say you and I know somebody, let's call him Bill the plumber, the guy who comes and fixes the pipes and the waterworks in your house and mine. Bill the plumber. Everybody can know Bill, but if it's Bill the plumber, your understanding who he is in relation to the work that he can accomplish, the work that he's capable, equipped, qualified to get underneath our sinks and to fix our plumbing. Bill the plumber. So when we're talking about Jesus the Messiah, we're not talking about, or Jesus Christ, we're not just simply talking about him like as if Christ or Messiah was like a last name. We're understanding Jesus in relation to his work and his ministry as the Messiah, as God's anointed one, the only one who is qualified to accomplish God's work, the necessary work to inaugurate God's kingdom on earth and God's plan, indeed his mission, to rescue his people and to renew all of creation. So when we're talking about Christology, we're talking about who Jesus is in relation to the work that he set out to do. So that's what you find in Christology. And another thing that you're also going to find out or see in Matthew is this another fancy word that's called typology. And typology really refers to the way in which a person who is acting in the same way, in the same fashion, doing the same things as a person who came before them, that when you see this person acting in this particular way, it's like he's functioning as a type of somebody else from long ago. One of the classic examples of this is what you would call a typology, a Moses typology, where in a lot of ways, in several different ways, you see Jesus functioning in a similar way, analogous to the way Moses functioned in being God's chosen to bring about salvation, redemption, restoration of the people of Israel out of Egypt and leading them into the promised land to become God's chosen, elect, covenant people. That Jesus is functioning in the same way, but even more so, even to a higher degree. Indeed, you could also say that in a lot of ways, with Jesus, there is also an Israel typology, where Jesus is doing the sort of things consistent with the nation of Israel, but with a big difference that Jesus is succeeding where Israel had failed. To that extent, you also see, you're going to see this word or variations of it throughout Matthew, and that is fulfillment. In other words, in a lot of ways, you could talk about fulfillment in terms of, say, like fulfilling a prophecy. So if a prophecy is predicted and Jesus does the sort of thing that the prophecy had predicted, in that way, he's fulfilling that prophecy. But fulfillment in Matthew is not just simply one of predictive prophecy, but rather he's the one who can accomplish the purposes of God, who can bring the purposes of what God intended to do in and through Israel, that God is fulfilling, he's accomplishing his work, his salvation, his redemptive purposes through Jesus Christ. So that you'll find here in Matthew talking about again and again and again about language of fulfillment, where Christ comes to fulfill. And another thing that you're also going to find out in relation to this fulfillment is this language of law that he comes on again and again and again, where he wants his audience to to see not in what ways that Christ and his work abolishes the law, but rather serves its fulfillment, that the purpose for which the law was given is achieved through Christ. Because the law was given not just simply as a means for articulating do's and don'ts or affording legislation for God's people, but rather the law is given as a way of shaping or instructing or showing how it is that we should live as God's image bearers, how we should live as God's people, and it's through Christ that the law is fulfilled. Which leads us to another point, where what you'll find, this is a unique thing to Matthew, is that Matthew, he is the only one who uses the language that we know that's called the church, where what it is that he has in mind, the way that he's demonstrating the words and works of Jesus Christ, that he understands it in relation to how the work of Christ has created a new humanity, a new type of people, a new way to be the people of God that's been made possible through Jesus Christ. That because of his work, we actually have this thing that's called the church. And for us, this is particularly important because we as the people, if we understand our relationship with God, not just in individualistic terms, but corporate terms, where what it is that God has accomplished doesn't just make a difference in my life, but it makes a difference in all of our lives and how we live life together. Jesus is showing us, indeed, a picture of what it is that the church should look like, which should instruct us. It should correct us in the way in which that we think about how we do this thing called the church. Because the church is supposed to be reflective of not only who Jesus is and what it is that he said, but should be instructive for us on how it is that we should live as the people of God. That's an emphasis that Matthew has. And lastly, because law and the church and fulfillment and typology is all in view, this last thing that's going to come down, or certainly come, is an emphasis of Matthew, is this word, ethics. Now, once again, this does not mean that Mark, Luke, or John have nothing to say about ethics, but that for Matthew, it is the sort of thing that he does emphasize for his audience, to say, in light of what it is that we can see as God's purposes through the gospel, through the good news of what God has done, how is it that we understand God's purposes for humanity? And because we can see God's purposes for humanity, that this affects or shapes or informs and changes, indeed renews our moral framework and informs how it is that we discern right from wrong, justice from injustice, righteousness from iniquity, which again is one of the last things, and we'll close with this, is this thing called righteousness. That is an emphasis in Matthew. And why it is that righteousness should be important is because of this, and we'll explain and then close. Righteousness is basically refers to right conduct. It's how it is that we know that we're making the right decisions. And what I find so fascinating about this is that when it comes to righteousness, in practice, all of us have an understanding of righteousness because all of us think that we're right. in our ethics, in our decisions, in our values, in our mores, that each of us, we think that we're right in our estimation about what is good and what is evil. And every culture has a different standard about what it is that righteousness is. Even while each of us have a practical understanding about righteousness, it's something that we can't get away from. That at the end of the day, the question that we're asking is not to simply, are my decisions, or the decisions of my family, or my community, my people group, are these actions that we're committing, are they right in our own eyes? Are they right in the sight of our culture? Are they right in the sight of our tribe? Are they right in the sight of a family unit? It forces us to ask the questions whether or not our actions are right in the sight of God. Because ultimately, it's God who is the one who has the power and the right and the authority to determine who is or who isn't righteous. And so, throughout Matthew's gospel, this is an emphasis that he lays on again and again and again, that forces us to I wouldn't say like reevaluate, but to correct our understanding of righteousness and to think about it in terms of not just our self-righteousness or our club's self-righteousness, but true righteousness, indeed holiness in the sight of God. It can be a real thing in light of what God has done, in light of the good news of the gospel. So I hope that mess of understanding of what you find in the Gospel of Matthew is going to be helpful as we're following through, beginning tomorrow, as Pastor Jesse El Padre brings us right into Matthew chapter 1. And thank you so much for taking the time to hear, to listen. And if you have any questions, also, you can shoot them my way through this email address. And I would love to engage with you and to help you in whatever way that I can. So, God bless you. Take care. I hope you enjoy your coffee as much as I do. And I look forward to seeing you next time.